The phone landed on the white tablecloth with a soft, deliberate thud. Not dropped, not forgotten, placed, the way you place a weapon before a fight you've been rehearsing for months. My daughter Emily looked across the candlelit table at Daniel, her fiancé of 11 months, the man we'd flown in from 3 states away to celebrate, the man whose ring sat on her finger like a promise, and she didn't smile. She didn't say a word. She just waited. And in that silence, in the golden flicker of those anniversary candles, I'd spent 45 minutes arranging. I watched 34 years of believing I understood my own family begin to come apart at the seams. Let me tell you about Daniel first, because if you're going to understand what happened that night, you need to understand why I loved him before I feared him. Daniel Mercer was 31 years old, tall in the unhurried way of a man who never needed to prove his height, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples when it rained and eyes the particular shade of brown that photographers call warm and mothers call trustworthy. He was a structural engineer, the kind of man who looked at a bridge and saw not just steel and cable, but the elegant mathematics holding everything together. He spoke carefully, listened completely, and laughed with his whole chest. He had driven 6 hours to help me carry my patio furniture inside before a hurricane warning 2 summers ago, the first summer Emily brought him home. He hadn't been asked. Emily had mentioned offhand on the phone that I was managing it alone, and he'd simply shown up at 7 in the morning with coffee and work gloves and said, "Where do you want to start, Mrs. Calloway?" I'd loved him then. Quietly, immediately, the way you love someone who shows you their character before they know you're watching. My husband Robert liked him too, which meant something. Robert was not a man who warmed to people easily. He was a high school history teacher for 26 years, a man who'd spent his career watching teenagers perform sincerity and had developed an immunity to it. He could spot a rehearsed answer from across a football field. But Daniel made him laugh, genuinely laugh, the kind that surprised Robert out of himself, and that was a rarer thing than any of us acknowledged aloud. So when Daniel asked Robert for Emily's hand in the old-fashioned way, called him on a Sunday morning, asked if they could speak privately, used the word permission with complete unironic earnestness. Robert had come downstairs with red eyes he blamed on allergies and told me we were getting a good one. We planned the engagement dinner for 6 months. Not a party, a dinner. Intimate. The 8 people who mattered most. Me and Robert, Emily's older brother Colin and his wife Mara, my sister Patricia and her husband Jean, and of course Emily and Daniel. I reserved the private room at Fortuna, the Italian restaurant in the old brick building downtown where we'd celebrated every milestone that mattered. Emily's high school graduation, Robert's retirement, Colin's promotion. Fortuna had witnessed all of us at our best. I'd chosen the menu myself. I'd ordered a custom cake. I'd written a small toast on note card stock because my hands shake when I'm emotional, and I didn't trust myself to remember the words. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted it to be the beginning of something. I had no idea it was the end. We arrived at Fortuna at 7. The private room glowed warm amber. I'd asked them to use the low lighting, the candles, the cream tablecloth. Bottles of Prosecco waited in ice. The hostess, a young woman named Bree who remembered us from Colin's promotion dinner, smiled and said the room looked beautiful. It did, I made sure of it. Daniel and Emily arrived together, of course, 5 minutes after us, while Robert and Colin were debating parking and Mara was helping me straighten the centerpiece I'd brought from home, white roses and eucalyptus in a low crystal vase. Emily was wearing the navy dress she'd called me about 3 weeks earlier, the one with the small pearl buttons at the collar. She looked like herself at her very best, composed, radiant, a little nervous in the way that made her eyes brighter. Daniel was in a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, open collar. He shook Robert's hand. He hugged me. He smelled like cedarwood and cold air. He told me the room was beautiful, and I believed him because he was looking at the roses when he said it, not at me. Patricia and Jean arrived last. Jean apologizing for the parking and Patricia already reaching for Prosecco before her coat was off, which was so perfectly Patricia that it made me feel, for a moment, that the universe was in correct order. We sat, we toasted. Daniel made a small joke about finally being allowed to call Robert something other than sir, and Robert said he hadn't decided that yet, and everyone laughed, and it was exactly what I had wanted it to be. Easy, warm, full of the particular pleasure of a room full of people who are glad to be together. The bread came, the salads came. The conversation moved the way good conversation does, no agenda, no effort, just people who liked each other following the current of the evening. Colin told a story about his daughter's school play. Jean talked about the fishing trip he'd been planning for 3 years and never taken. Patricia refilled my glass without being asked, because she has always known me better than I know myself. And Emily was quiet. Not rude quiet, not sad quiet. She was participating, nodding, laughing at the right moments. But I am her mother, and I have been watching her face since it was the only thing in the world I needed to watch, and I knew the difference between Emily at ease and Emily holding something back. She was holding something. I thought it was emotion. I thought, and I'm ashamed of how simple I was, how eager to find the comfortable explanation. I thought she was overwhelmed, that the realness of it was hitting her, that she was sitting at this table surrounded by the people who'd loved her longest, wearing the ring of the man she'd chosen, and she was simply feeling it all and trying not to cry. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. She smiled at me, and it was real, and I relaxed. I should not have relaxed. The entrees arrived at 8:15. I remember because Jean made a comment about the timing and Robert checked his watch and said they ran a tight kitchen here. We were midway through the main course, Robert's osso buco, my branzino, Daniel's lamb that he'd ordered with such specific attention to preparation that the waiter had written it down twice, when Emily set her phone on the table. Face up. Right next to her barely touched risotto. Placed it with the kind of deliberateness that stops a room, even if the room doesn't know why it stopped. Conversation continued, technically. Jean was finishing a sentence. Patricia was reaching for more bread, but something in the air changed, the way pressure changes before weather. Emily looked at Daniel. He was cutting his lamb. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, something crossed his face there and gone in less than a second, the flash of a man who has been caught thinking about a closed door, and then he smiled. What? He said light, easy. I think, Emily said, that we should talk about something. Robert set down his fork. Colin looked at Mara. Patricia, who has always had the best instincts in any room, put down her wine glass without taking a sip. Daniel said, and his voice was still pleasant, but the pleasant had a structure under it now, a framework of careful control. This isn't. I've been trying to figure out the right moment, Emily said. I decided there isn't one, so. She looked around the table at me, at her father, at Colin. I need everyone to know something, and I need Daniel to know that I know. The word no landed like a stone in still water. Daniel put down his knife. Emily, his voice was low now, the pleasantness gone, not angry, controlled. The voice of a man choosing each word the way he'd choose weight-bearing material. What are you doing? I'm telling the truth, she said. I think that's what people do at a table full of the people they love. Patricia reached over and took my hand. I hadn't realized I needed that until she did it. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you about the summer 2 years ago. The summer before Daniel, the summer Emily came home from Seattle having quit a job she'd loved and moved out of an apartment she'd carefully furnished and arrived on my doorstep with 4 boxes and a face like a window with all the blinds drawn. She'd never told us why, not the full why. She'd given us scaffolding. I needed a change. The company was going in a direction I didn't believe in. I wanted to reassess. Robert and I had accepted the scaffolding because she was 31 years old and entitled to her reasons, and because we'd learned, over a decade of parenting an adult, that there are questions you don't press and doors you leave open instead of knocking on. She'd stayed with us for 4 months. She'd gone on long walks. She'd helped Robert reorganize the garage. She'd sat with me in the kitchen on weekend mornings and drunk coffee, and sometimes we'd talked, and sometimes we just sat in the same comfortable quiet that is its own kind of intimacy. She'd seemed, by the time she left for a new job in Portland, like herself again. Lighter. I'd attributed it to rest, to the reset, to the particular healing that comes from being somewhere you are unconditionally loved. What she'd been, I would understand much later, was not healed but decided. She had come home to gather herself. She had spent those 4 months not just resting but resolving something, reaching a conclusion so enormous that it required that long just to carry it quietly. She had come home because of Daniel. Not the Daniel I knew, the Daniel she'd met 18 months before she brought him to meet us, the Daniel from Seattle. I am going to tell you what Emily said at that table, but I want you to understand something first. What I felt, sitting there in the amber light of that private room at Fortuna, with the roses I'd arranged and the Prosecco we'd toasted with, and Robert's hand finding mine under the table at some point during Emily's words. What I felt was not one thing. It never is, at the moments that matter. I felt fear. I felt something I can only describe as grief, though I couldn't have told you yet what I was grieving. And underneath both of those things, so quiet I almost didn't recognize it, I felt a terrible, clarifying love for my daughter, for the courage it took to do what she was doing, in front of everyone she loved, in the room I'd arranged for celebration. Emily and Daniel had met at a conference in Seattle. He'd been there representing his firm. She'd been a presenter. They'd had dinner, then drinks, then a conversation that lasted until 2 in the morning in a hotel lobby, the kind of conversation that only happens a few times in a life, and that you spend years afterward either chasing or reckoning with. They dated for 6 months before she discovered it. He was engaged. Not to her, already. To a woman named Simone back in Portland where Daniel lived and where he had told Emily, across 4 months of relationship, that he had an elderly aunt. Emily had found out by accident, the way these things are always found out, not by investigation, but by the ordinary, devastating coincidence of the world being smaller than the people in it imagine. A mutual colleague, a mention, a name. And then, because Emily has always been the kind of person who would rather know a terrible truth than live in a comfortable lie, she'd looked, and she'd found, and she'd ended things immediately and completely, the way she did everything. She'd moved back home not to heal from a heartbreak, but to decide whether to tell Simone, to sit with the weight of holding information that belonged to a woman she'd never met, a woman who was planning a wedding to a man who had spent 4 months lying to them both. She'd told Simone, a letter, carefully written. She'd told me about the letter but not its contents, and I'd thought it was a professional reference. Simone had called off the engagement. Daniel had lost his position at his firm. Simone's father was a founding partner. And then, 18 months later, Daniel Mercer had appeared at a mutual friends gathering in Portland, where Emily had eventually moved, and he had looked at her across a room with the specific expression of a man who believed that time erases consequence, and he had said, "I've changed. I know what I did. I know what I lost, and I have spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of telling you that." He'd been charming. He'd been patient. He'd been, and here was the unbearable part, the part that made me press my other hand over Robert's hand under the table. He'd been everything she'd hoped he would be, back in the beginning, before she'd known. She'd let herself believe it. She'd believed it for 11 months, through meeting us, through the ring, through 6 months of engagement dinner planning. She had wanted to believe it, which is the oldest and most human of all our vulnerabilities. She'd set an alert, a small, automatic thing she'd set up 2 years ago and forgotten, a news aggregator tracking Daniel's name, something she'd done during the worst of it and never dismantled. And 3 weeks ago, it had returned something new. A woman named Karen, a dating profile, screenshotted and posted publicly in a Facebook group for people who'd been deceived by the same man. A different name in the post. Daniel sometimes went by his middle name, Marcus, but the face was the same. The job, described differently but recognizably the same. The story, charming, patient, earnest. Engaged to Karen for 4 months before she discovered he'd been simultaneously involved with 2 other women. The timing, overlapping with the first 3 months of his relationship with Emily. Emily had spent 3 weeks confirming it. She had spoken to Karen. She had spoken to one of the other women. She had assembled, quietly and completely, a picture so clear it required no interpretation. And then she had come to Fortuna in her navy dress, and she had set her phone on the table, and she had looked at him. Daniel said nothing for a long time. Long enough that Jean, who was perhaps the least equipped person at that table to sit with silence, said Daniel, and Patricia put a hand on Jean's arm and stopped him. Then Daniel said, "I can explain this." "I know you can," Emily said. "You're very good at explaining things. That's one of the things I genuinely admired about you." "Emily, do you want to see the messages?" She touched her phone. "I have them here, I thought." Her voice wavered, the first time it wavered all night, and she stopped and breathed, and when she continued it was steady again. "I thought you deserved to face them, in a room full of witnesses, the way Simone deserved a witness and didn't have one." Robert pushed back his chair, not violently, quietly. He stood up slowly, the way he'd stood up at the end of 30 years of classrooms, with a measured gravity that had always made teenagers understand that something important was about to be said. "I'd like you to go," Robert said to Daniel. "Now, please." Daniel looked at him. He looked at Emily. He looked at me, and I don't know what he expected to find in my face. Appeal, maybe. Intervention. A mother's instinct to smooth things over. I had felt that instinct, I won't pretend I hadn't, but I felt something stronger. I felt my daughter's 3 weeks of quiet, solitary courage, sitting across from me at a table I decorated. I said nothing, I just looked back at him. Daniel picked up his napkin from his lap and folded it and set it on the table with the same kind of deliberate placement with which Emily had set down her phone. He stood. He buttoned his blazer. "I did love you," he said to Emily. "I need you to know that." "I know," Emily said. "I think that's the saddest part." He left. We heard the door of the private room close. We heard his footsteps on the hardwood past the bar. We heard the main door of Fortuna, and then we heard nothing except the ambient murmur of the restaurant around us and the soft percussion of our own breathing. My sister Patricia was the first one to move. She got up from her chair and came around the table and pulled Emily against her without saying anything, just held her, and Emily pressed her face into Patricia's shoulder and shook, not crying, or not only crying, but releasing something that had been held at great internal cost for 3 weeks, maybe longer, maybe for the 2 years since Seattle. Robert sat back down. His face was the face of a man who was keeping himself very composed in order to be useful, which I recognized because it is my face too, and we have been married 38 years. Colin said, God, I'm so sorry." He came around to her too, and then it was Patricia and Colin and Mara around her like a small warm wall, and Robert and I sitting across from each other in the candlelight, and Jean quietly lifting the Prosecco from the ice bucket and refilling everyone's glass with the instinct of a man who understood that some situations call for nothing more than making sure the glasses are full. I looked at the centerpiece, the white roses, the eucalyptus, the crystal vase I'd carried from home because I'd wanted everything to be exactly right. I thought, she didn't tell us before tonight because she wanted witnesses. She wanted us here. Not to protect her, she'd already made her decision long before she sat down, but because she loved us enough to let us be present for the real thing, even when the real thing was not what any of us had planned. That is, I thought, a remarkable kind of love. The kind that trusts people with the full truth of a moment instead of the curated version. The kind that says, I know this will hurt you and I am bringing it to you anyway because you deserve to know who you are to me. We stayed at Fortuna for another 2 hours. Not because anyone planned to. We stayed because nobody wanted to be the first to leave, and then we stopped wanting to leave, and somewhere in that transformation, the evening became something none of us had expected, but that all of us, I think, will remember longer than any celebration could have made us. The waiter, a patient, perceptive young man who had clearly registered that something significant had occurred and had responded by giving us unobtrusive, impeccable service, brought out the dessert course and then quietly disappeared. The cake, the custom one I'd ordered, came out on its own. White fondant, gold lettering, Emily and Daniel in a curving script I'd approved a month ago. Emily looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up a fork and cut herself a piece from the corner. It's good cake, she said. It would be a shame. Patricia laughed first. Then Colin. Then Mara and Jean and Robert and me, real laughter, the kind that arrives after fear has passed, the kind that is also a little bit tears and a little bit exhaustion, and mostly just the overwhelming relief of a room full of people who love each other and are, despite everything, still together. We ate the cake. We talked, really talked, the way the best conversations happen without plan or performance. Emily told us more about Seattle than she'd ever told us, and I understood as she talked that she'd needed this. Not our advice or our protection, but our presence, our witnesses. She'd handled it alone, and now she was letting us hold it with her. Colin told a story about a woman he'd dated briefly in college who had turned out to be going by a false name, not maliciously, he clarified. She just liked the name better, which somehow made it funnier, and Emily laughed until she was wiping her eyes. Robert gave a toast, not the one I'd written on note card stock. I'd never had the chance to give it. His was unplanned, unwritten. He held his glass and looked around the table and said, I had a toast prepared, about Daniel. I'll spare you that one. Small laughter. What I want to say instead is this. The best thing I've ever done is watch the people at this table become who they are. And I am more grateful tonight for exactly this room, exactly these people, exactly this honesty, than I would have been for any version of an evening that went according to plan. He sat down. Patricia said quietly, that was better than anything you had written. And Robert said equally quietly, I know. Driving home, Robert and I were quiet for a while. The easy quiet of people who have been through something together and don't yet need to name it. Then he said she knew when she invited us. Yes. She could have done it alone, or just with Emily, or just with us. Yes. He was quiet another moment. The streetlights moved across the windshield. She wanted a table full of people who loved her, he said, when she told him the truth. Yes. He nodded slowly. That's our daughter. Emily called me the next morning at 8. I'd been awake for an hour already. I'd slept the way you sleep after large events, fitfully. Surfacing often, the night full of reprocessed images. The phone placed on the tablecloth, Daniel folding his napkin, the cake with its gold lettering that we'd eaten down to the board. How are you? I asked, which was both insufficient and the only place to start. I'm okay, she said, and then, I'm better than okay. I'm Mom, I feel like I can breathe. Good, I said, that's good, Em. I wanted to do it there, she said. I need you to understand why. You wanted witnesses. A pause. I wanted my family. There's a difference. There is. I thought about that difference for the rest of the morning. The rest of the week, honestly, I'm still thinking about it. A witness watches. A family carries. She hadn't brought us there to watch her be brave. She'd brought us there so we could carry it with her, share the weight of it, the way families do with everything that matters. Not taking turns with it, but holding it simultaneously together all at once. In the weeks that followed, several things happened. Karen, the woman from the Facebook group, contacted Emily after seeing that Emily had looked at her post. They spoke on the phone for nearly 2 hours. Karen was in the process of pursuing legal action for financial losses she'd incurred during the relationship. Emily provided what she could. Daniel's name, his real name, and his professional aliases began appearing in several of those Facebook groups. The particular form of accountability that is possible now, in an age when the world is smaller than people think, and the closed doors are never as closed as they seem. Emily did not start this. She didn't stop it either. She told me about it matter-of-factly, and I said nothing, and she said, "I think Simone would have wanted someone to do this for her." And I thought about Emily writing that letter 2 years ago, a letter to a stranger, because it was the right thing to do, and I understood that my daughter had always known exactly who she was. She had simply been waiting for the rest of us to catch up. I still have the toast I'd written on note card stock, the one I'd practiced in front of the bathroom mirror, the one about watching Emily grow into a woman whose happiness was the clearest measure of my own. I haven't thrown it away, but I haven't needed it either. The night at Fortuna was the occasion I wrote it for, just not the evening. The real toast, the one that mattered, that I'd give again in any version of that night, was Robert's. Unplanned. True. I am more grateful for exactly this than I would have been for anything that went according to plan. 6 months later, Emily sent me a photo. She was standing in front of a window somewhere I didn't recognize, a new apartment. She'd moved again, this time to a city she'd been wanting to try for years. The light coming through the window was morning light, the clean, flat kind. She was in an oversized sweater, no makeup, holding a coffee mug in both hands, and she was smiling. Not the composed smile of a woman managing a public emotion, the other kind, the private kind, the smile of someone alone in a room that is entirely their own. I put the photo on the refrigerator. Robert asked who took it. "She took it herself," I said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went and made coffee and brought me a cup without being asked, which is the domestic version of everything he'd said that night at the table, and which I understood exactly. We stood in the kitchen looking at the photo of our daughter in her morning light, and I thought about a table set for celebration, and a phone placed with precision, and the truth arriving, as it always does, not on the schedule we make for it, but on its own. And I thought, she is going to be fine. Not because the ending was what I'd planned for, but because I had seen her, really seen her, stand at a table covered in roses and candlelight and speak the truth directly into the face of someone who had counted on her silence. There is no engagement I could have celebrated that would have shown me more of who she was. There is no dinner I would trade for it.